It's Wednesday, the 14th of December. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Damian Green, Labour MP Clive Lewis, Naomi Smith from Best for Britain, which campaigns for a closer relationship with the EU, and Alex Phillips, political commentator and a former Brexit Party MEP. Today, emergency services are responding in Kent after a small migrant boat ran into difficulties in the English Channel this morning. We'll be going to our correspondent at the scene very shortly.
We cannot persist with a system that was designed for a different era. We have to stop the boats.
We need to bring this to an end. That means a proper plan to crack down on the gangs.
Will the Prime Minister's plan to stop the Channel crossings work? The government wants a trade deal with India. Will that mean more immigration?
We're now outside the EU, outside the single market. The question now is, do we reopen all of that, which I think won't help the economy?
Labour and the government say Brexit isn't holding back the economy, but are they right?
We've been invited for a meeting with the Rail Minister, and as soon as we can get that arranged, we'll be in there trying to get an improved package for our people. There is a deal to be done.
RMT boss Mick Lynch wants to talk to the government. He'll be doing that live in this studio later. And Rishi Sunak will face Keir Starmer for the final PMQs of 2022. Hello, as we come on air, a rescue operation is underway in Kent. We've been told that 3 people have been confirmed dead as a small boat carrying migrants has run into difficulties. Let's go to Dover. We're going to talk to him in just a moment. You can see the scene here. It looks, of course, pretty calm. But a government official has told us that, as I say, at least 3 people have been confirmed dead in the English Channel. Let's talk to our correspondent there, Simon Jones. Simon, what is the latest?
Well, I'm at the entrance to the lifeboat station here. As you can see, there's a police cordon here, and the Dover lifeboat has just returned to shore, and they have brought back a body bag. So we know that at least 3 people have died in this incident. Now, the boat set out from the coast of northern France in the early hours of this morning, but it got into difficulty at around 3 a.m. There were approximately 50 people on board. We understand that 43 people have been rescued alive. Around 30 of those people were rescued from the water, but sadly a number of people have lost their lives. 3 people, we're told, although that figure could change because it's very much an ongoing search and rescue operation. It has been a huge operation because 4 lifeboats from Kent were sent to the area, along with 2 Coast Guard helicopters from the UK and also a French naval helicopter. That gives you some idea of the response we've been talking about and the seriousness of this incident. And the reality is, overnight it was incredibly cold in the Channel, so once people were in the water, then there was only a short space of time for them to be able to be rescued because the water is so cold at this time of year. We've heard from the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, who says she's being kept up to date with what's been happening in the Channel. She says her heartfelt thoughts are with all those affected, and also the local MP has been describing her shock. Natalie Elphick has been also speaking to the Home Secretary to be kept up to date with this incident. But it was just yesterday, of course, that the government were announcing a 5-point plan to try to bring an end to these Channel crossings. Now, that partly as a response to concern over the number of people making the crossing, but also partly due to the dangers, the fact that this route is so dangerous, and once again we've seen how it can be deadly.
There in Dover, thank you very much. Simon, obviously talking about the freezing cold waters. You haven't got much chance of survival if you end up capsizing or falling into that water. What is your reaction, Damian?
Well, like everyone else, it's shock and horror. It shows why this traffic isn't only a political issue, if you like. It's a very real human issue. It's an extremely dangerous way to try and get to this country, and the more we can do to stop it, the better. I think, incidentally, that if they've rescued 30 people from the water overnight, last night, given the temperature, that, you know, we can't say enough in admiration of the rescue services that have done it. That's an extraordinary effort. But obviously, it's clearly a tragedy if people are dying. But as I say, it illustrates why we need to stop this traffic.
I mean, the boats have been coming all through the year, and this is particularly dangerous when we've said the temperatures are so freezing cold. It is a huge operation. We just heard there from Simon Jones in terms of the rescue of the majority, hopefully, of those people that were coming across. But your reaction?
I think it's devastating, and I think, you know, look, we're all going to sit here and wring our hands and say how terrible this is. It is terrible. But, you know, the reality is there's a reason people are in those boats, and that's because there are simply no safe and legal routes of entry into the United Kingdom. And if you don't have those safe and legal routes, you force people into the hands of the smugglers who bring people in through those dangerous routes. They don't care about those people. I think we can all agree on that. But there is a necessity for this government to stop with the rhetoric, stop with the division, and actually deal with this properly. And that is to open up safe and legal routes. And if you don't do that, then there will be more deaths.
Naomi?
Simple as that. I
don't think anybody puts themselves or their families at risk of such a crossing. It's not just freezing temperatures, it has been well below freezing for the last few nights, in such a dangerous, perilous situation, unless they are fleeing something pretty terrible. You know, I agree wholeheartedly with what Clive has said. The lack of detail about what those legal, safe routes of passage are going to be from Sunak yesterday, you know, was disappointing. And of course, Suella Braverman's appearance at the Home Affairs Committee within the last couple of weeks, where neither she nor her staff could name how a person fleeing persecution in Africa could safely reach the UK. It is high time that those legal and safe routes of passage are restored.
Alex?
This has been it's an utter tragedy, isn't it, when you see this number of people dying. And you're right, when you put yourself and your family's lives at risk to make such a perilous crossing, you are desperate. However, we have to be pragmatic and we have to look at the reality of this situation. Safe and legal routes, where they are utterly necessary, must be established. But if you determine that all economic migrants should have access to safe and legal routes, you're going to have a situation where embassies and high commissions are utterly overwhelmed. We've had 500,000 people net migration so far this year. If you establish safe and legal routes around the world, what on earth is that number going to look like? We've also got to be clear who is responsible for this tragedy today. It is the people traffickers. And I'm pleased to hear that Rishi Sunak is announcing extra firepower to the NCA, 700 extra staff. That is great. Why has this not been done earlier? Why are the advertisements for such illegal crossings allowed to flagrantly take place on social media platforms? Why is this not being cracked down on? There's clearly a government policy drag when it comes to tackling the criminal aspect of these crossings.
Right, and we're going to talk about some of the things that Rishi Sunak and the government is proposing. But just to tell viewers that we'll be talking to our correspondent Simon Jones towards the end of the programme after Prime Minister's questions at the scene with the latest in Dover. Let's have a look at some of the front pages, taking in what you've been saying. The Daily Mail, Rishi, I'll fix appalling asylum farce. We have this in the Telegraph, Sunak, I will stop those who get here by cheating, and that is to include people coming over in small boats. And then the Eye has a slightly different headline, Pontin's revolt. You may have heard yesterday, Tory backlash at plan to house migrants in holiday camps, moving them out of hotels. It includes, Rishi Sunak says, more staff to deal with the huge backlog in terms of asylum claims. Also underlining an agreement, a deal with Albania for returns of people who come in those small boats from that particular country. Is it going to work?
It's a significant step forward. I mean, both the extra capacity for enforcement at the border, also the release, therefore, of border force officers to crack down on illegal working, and perhaps most significantly, the deal with Albania. Albania is a safe country. It's a NATO ally of ours. It's applying for membership of the EU. A third of the people on this appalling traffic across the Channel are from Albania. There is no reason for anyone to be desperate in Albania to come to this country.
Except for modern slavery, according to Theresa May, who I think is showing some disappointment, the former Prime Minister. It was when she was Home Secretary, I think, that these new modern slavery laws were brought in. She doesn't think it needs an overhaul.
I think it needs tweaking. Clearly, the modern slavery legislation is very good because modern slavery does exist. But as with any legislation like that, there are clearly people who are exploiting it, exploiting loopholes. They are not modern slaves. They are saying they're modern slaves, and therefore we have an obligation to keep them here.
I mean, will it work, Clive? I mean, more people to process their backlog, surely, is a good thing.
So first of all, this government has had 12 years to do what it wanted to do on this issue. So for Rishi Sunak to stand up yesterday and sound like he just got into the job and found this disaster is a bit rich, frankly. So 12 years, this has been on their watch. Whatever their watch has been and whatever their policies have been, it's been on their watch. That's the first thing. I'm looking at that headline. Pontins revolt, Tory backlash at plan to house migrants in holiday camps. Let's be really clear here. My understanding is if you put a group of people concentrated into a camp, as you did in South Africa in the Boer War, that's what you call a concentration camp. Now, I'm not making any, making it. No, it is. It's a concentration. It's a concentration. It's a concentration of people. I'm prepared. Well, look what they're talking about: putting people in camps en masse because of their mess. Let's just be really clear what we are. That is the technical term.
Language is important. Language is important here.
So language is important, but so is motivation and what this government is doing. So this has been on their watch, and they are doing this. And do you know what? Those people that died in that boat are not responsible for the NHS waiting list. Those people that died in that boat are not responsible for poverty pay, for food banks. And look at this government. After 12 years, they're stood here going, oh, look, a crisis. Don't look at the NHS. Look at these people coming in here. It's the oldest trick in the book. We should be sick and tired of it. We know what it's about.
Every bit of that is nonsense. And also, so is the headline that there's going to be a huge revolt over taking people out of hotels and putting them in, whether it's holiday camps or former student accommodation. That's just not true. This idea that this is some kind of distraction, this is a real problem. People really care about the fact that 40,000 people are coming here in this way. This is not a confected problem. It's a genuine problem. And the immigration system has got better.
Let him finish.
The immigration, I know, I was the immigration minister when we came in 2010. It was in an absolute state. We improved it. Theresa May was a very successful Home Secretary, and it's got worse again. One of the things we did was stop people coming over in the backs of lorries. Remember that? People died in some of those as well. We had tragedies there.
But they're coming over now in small boats.
In small boats. And because we solved that, in cooperation with the French, they've gone on to another method. So we now have to solve that. Things change over time.
Let me just... I will come to you both, but let me just go back to some of the things that Clive said. First of all, what's the difference between what Labour and Keir Starmer are suggesting in terms of tackling this issue? I remember Keir Starmer saying what we need are more staff to process the huge backlog of asylum applications and better bureaucracy. I should think he also supports the deal with Albania in terms of returning people whom he would think are economic migrants. So there is no difference, Clive. Despite your passion, there is no difference.
So look, so sorting out the backlog makes complete sense, OK? No one wants to be left. I deal with thousands of constituents, hundreds of constituents every year who are living in limbo. There are 20,000 in this country living in limbo, waiting for decision. Let's make sure that they get through. That will ease what's called a crisis in this country. That makes sense. Albania, yes. Albania, many of those people may be able to go back to Albania. But look, I can be really clear here. Sir Richard Dannatt came to me, the former head of the armed services, with a woman from Albania who, if she was sent back, was going to be killed. She's now in this country. So we can't put a blanket coverage on that. There are things... So I think,
but hang on, Clive, Diane Abbott, your colleague, said very recently on BBC Newscast that the only difference, as far as she could see, between what Keir Starmer was saying and what the government is proposing is the Rwanda policy, which you do disagree with.
Yes, of course.
But apart from from that, there is no difference.
No one is in dispute about sorting out the backlog, because many of those people will end up getting indefinite leave to remain. Some people will have their claims rejected. There's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with the Labour Party taking that position. That's a sensible position to take. What I want to see is this issue not being used for political benefit, which I think it is being used, in distractionism, and also a level of humanity towards people. We're part of the European Convention on Refugees. You know, that was born out of the ashes of fascism and the Second World War. Let's not forget that. And there are lots of people on the benches opposite me talking about getting rid of that, leaving from the ECHR and the human rights. Let's be really clear here. Let's have a humanitarian approach to this.
All right. Will it work, though? Rishi Sunak's plan?
Well, Clive said that language matters, and it does. And if we just listen to some of his language from yesterday, he said, Damien, any solution should be not just what works, but what is right, suggesting he thinks a policy which fails to achieve its purpose might still be correct in some way. Unclear whether he means the Rwanda policy, which hasn't worked, whether he means the hostile environment under Theresa May, which hasn't worked. These are, policies that have failed to control immigration in the way some would like, and have neither shown compassion to those that deserve it and need it. So, language does matter, and that, I thought it was an extraordinary thing for a Prime Minister to say about how government policy should be judged.
Let Damien respond. I'll come to Alex.
What he said was the exact opposite of your interpretation.
No, he said any solution should be not just what works, but what is right.
Not just what works, but what is right. So it has to be right as well as effective. That's
not righteous,
seems to me an uncontroversial statement. You're interpreting it the exact opposite of what his actual words mean.
All right, do you want to respond to that first?
Well, I can assure you it doesn't sound like that to many people that are interpreted.
But it's a matter of
somehow that we have a moral obligation to deny people seeking sanctuary here en masse deporting Albanians. 86% of Albanians who have applied for asylum here have been granted it because they were victims
and nobody, literally nobody,
slavery.
has been granted asylum from Albania in Germany, in the Netherlands, in Sweden, in other democracies in Western Europe. So there is something wrong
we
with that.
We have a much lower number of asylum applicants than most of Europe.
Well, not most of Europe, but we aren't at the top of the table. Do you agree, though, about humanity, about the language that is used, and about the fact that the vast majority of people who come over in small boats make their asylum claims are successful?
When it comes to language, we can sit here all day and debate what language is nice, what we should use and what we shouldn't. It doesn't solve the problem. And despite the deluge of left-wing platitudes and calling Pontins a concentration camp, there is something that Clive said earlier that I agree with, which is, why for the last 12 years have the policies that are being introduced now, why have they not been done? My concern is this is going to be bunnism, and that Rishi Sunak is promising things. We do hope they work. They have to work. They have to work for the Conservative Party's political success. They have to work to stop these horrific crossings happening. Why have these not been done? And the thing that I worry about is the lack of a multilateral deal with France. That is critical in all of this. And also the lack of consideration of migration law, including things like membership of the ECHR, which is the thing that has hamstrung those Rwanda flights. I mean, that was a farcical policy from the beginning. Anybody
But do you agree with the policy?
I don't agree with the Rwanda policy at all. Largely because, actually, it was always going to be unworkable for this very reason.
If we talk about a deal with France, of course, when we were members of the EU, we had the Dublin Protocol, which actually made it a lot easier.
That didn't work in the way it was supposed to, or as effectively as it might have done. We're going to move on. I want to just show you this headline in the Financial Times talking about a trade deal with India. This is the International Trade Secretary Kemi Badenoch refusing to set deadline for India trade deal. So we don't know exactly when it's going to be done. Apparently they are quite close. She's been in the country talking to her counterpart. Immigration is thought to be one of the remaining issues to resolve between the two countries. India reportedly wants greater access to business visas for professionals. Now, it comes after Rishi Sunak, you can see here the headline in the Daily Mail, agreed a deal with Narendra Modi for degree-educated Indian graduates aged 18 to 30 to come to the UK for up to 2 years. It was done at the G20 talks. Should we accept immigration in exchange for a good trade deal with India, Naomi?
Well, can I just start by saying how wonderful it is that we now don't do trade deals by photo opportunity and Instagram. It's really great to see.
How wonderful we do trade deals at all.
Well, there's the Australia trade deal, of course.
Well, thanks to Brexit, we can now make trade deals. It's a fabulous thing.
And yes, and that 800 billion boon that Michael Gove's been talking about is actually all just rollover deals. And yet again, we've found out that the government haven't been honest with us about the benefits of them. Great that we're able to do
and should we accept higher immigration in exchange?
All trade deals are negotiations. I'm very pro-immigration. I think it's a brilliant thing both for our coffers. We know that the vast majority of migrants have a net benefit
GDP.
impact on GDP, but also culturally, of course, has a hugely beneficial impact to Britain. We are a nation of migrants. So what's interesting today, though, is that the government's own migration advisory committee has reported that wage growth in sectors reliant on labour pre-Brexit have now lagged on wage growth. So we do need migrants. We've got 1.2 million unemployed. We've got 1.2 million vacancies across the economy.
All right.
So we do need people to fill them.
I mean, the net migration figures, the most recent, were at a historic high of 504,000. To put that into context, around 200,000 students coming from abroad to study here, and another 200,000 from war-torn parts of the world, and schemes to bring people from Hong Kong and Afghanistan and Ukraine. Should we accept higher immigration or more immigration from countries like India in exchange for a good trade deal?
It depends on the immigration. You can't just say all immigration's good, all immigration's bad. It depends what, who, where they're going, how long they're staying, how we're managing this. I am so excited about this trade deal with India. This is exactly what we're supposed to be doing with Brexit. India, we already trade 23 billion with India. We want to double that by 2030. Only 3% of our product lines at the moment are tariff-free. India is one of the fastest growing economies in the world with really exciting markets in innovative technologies, and especially things such as pharmaceuticals. When you look at the costs we could save the NHS by getting imported generic medicines, it is incredible. This is something the EU are not doing because they're too protectionist in the pockets of big pharma. We need to be focusing on the benefits of this. If this means taking in Indian students and skilled Indian workers,
you're happy
for that. But there is a caveat. You cannot have a situation where people coming over to do a master's degree are bringing their entire families. If they're doing research at PhD level in critical sectors, yes, they are important to shaping modern Britain and driving us into the future, helping us to innovate. If they're coming to study for an MA only, they cannot bring all of their relatives.
I'm loving the detail here in terms of what they can and can't do in terms of people coming from abroad. But actually, we have labour shortages, don't we, Damien, in many, many areas. So they might not all be the sorts of people that Alex is talking about. Do we not need immigration from other parts or other sectors from abroad to fill the labour shortages here?
Some will be, and we have a shortage occupation list, and that's precisely for that purpose. And
does it need to be expanded?
It changes over time of where we have shortages of labour. We have, one of the things I bang on about a lot is social care. We have a huge shortage of labour in the care sector, and so that should be a shortage occupation. I think the key point to pick up on something Alex said is that there are immigrants who increase not just our GDP but our GDP per head, which is what matters.
Not just overall. You're talking,
but actually increase the productivity and.
But we've had Suella Braverman very recently saying she still wants to bring down immigration levels, net migration, to below 100,000.
Well, if that's economically sensible, then that obviously has less stress and strain on our infrastructure. So there is, and if you let it go completely out of control, then you have genuine problems in society.
A big sigh there from you, Clive. If you can just hold for a moment more, because we're going to hear Sir Keir Starmer talking about the issue of immigration at the CBI conference in November.
But our common goal must be to help the British economy off its immigration dependency. But let me tell you, the days when low pay and cheap labour are part of the British way on growth must end.
Do you agree with him that the UK needs to wean itself off immigration?
So it depends on how you're looking at this. I think I'm agreeing with Alex here, made the point, which is that the immigration can be beneficial. And so I think we need to be really clear here. You can't. There's a lot of cakeism going on. It's like you want to scream about immigration, and it's interesting how we've gone seamlessly from asylum to immigration. The two are very separate. I think we need to be clear about that. But there is this kind of people kind of put them in the same box. But
and also,
on this though, you know, there are shortages in social care. But there's a reason there are shortages in social care. It's partly because it's underfunded, low paid, poor quality work for many people. The way to sort that out is to increase the amount of resource we put into social care, take it back under public control, and then pay people properly and give them decent career progression and rewards for that. And you'll find that people will want to go and do that because it's a very rewarding job. Now, I personally don't think that what we should be starting from a point on is saying, well, we'll take this many doctors, this many nurses, this many social care workers from some of the poorest countries in the world to boost our GDP. That's not where we should be coming from. What we should be doing is trying our very best to pay people properly, skill and train people up in the NHS in this country. Well, and that's what that's always the first point we should start from. And then you talk about, but look, we've got an ageing population. Yep. Yeah, if you look at Scotland, they're desperate for immigration for their economy, and here in the UK as well. So we can have a sensible conversation about this, but you can't do that if you're screaming about immigration.
Well, I mean, what do you say about Clive's assertion that actually taking people, skilled people from abroad, wasn't what Brexit was necessarily supposed to be about? It was about training people here. Hasn't happened, has it?
Well, you've got to do both. I mean, clearly that you can have short-term problems where you do need to bring people in from abroad, but at the same time, absolutely. I mean, as it happens, I think that nurses in social care should be on the same pay scale as the NHS, because it's not just a question of recruitment, it's a question of retention. And I noticed Clive slipped in there.
Just got to put that.
Take it back into public control. Social care has never been in public control, and if you close down all the care homes that were in private control, then you would have the world's biggest national crisis. So that's a really, really bad idea.
I wasn't suggesting that. But
well, you
no.
Well, anyway,
whatever. Yeah. But I think on the point of immigration, it is actually, in the end, quite nuanced. You have to say, this group we now need, in 10 years' time we may not, but at the same time, absolutely, we have to reskill our economy. That's a permanent challenge for any government.
Right, it wasn't necessarily that nuanced during the debate, years of debate about immigration. So it's interesting that people are now talking about it beyond bald figures. I mean, when it comes to the Brexit debate, there's talk of taking back control of our borders. Do you think that's actually been met, Alex?
Well, it's interesting. You're saying that the debate wasn't very nuanced when we were having it during all those years we were campaigning for Brexit, but that's because our migration wasn't very nuanced, was it? We just had an open-door policy to Europe. That has no nuance at all. That says if you happen to be from a predominantly white European country, come on in, whoever you are. People from the rest of the world who might have skills that we need are having to go through
But what about the brain drain that Clive is talking about?
What about
the brain drain then taking...
I agree with Clive.
Stop it, you two.
No, but I do actually, because what this creates actually is a dearth of much-needed skills in the countries of origin. I also agree with Clive. We don't pay nurses enough. Nurses in the UK are paid 50% of the amount, 50% less than those in Canada. They only paid a quarter of what they're paid in America. But we need to actually make sure that when it comes to... And also, why are we making nurses do degrees in this country?
All right.
Why are we...
Well,
why are we
just before I get to you to come back, particularly on the issue of the open-door policy, when we were part of the EU, is 504,000 net migration, which you're absolutely right, does not include people claiming asylum or the small boat crossings. No, but I just want to get... Is that too high?
I think you've got to look at this in a couple of ways. Is it too high in terms of how we can plan our infrastructure, our economy, when it comes to...
Yes or no?
It's very difficult. Yes, I would say when it comes to looking at things like education, expanding the NHS, we're not in a position where we're able to accommodate them. But we do need to be looking at... I think if those figures were never published, actually, this debate would take on a completely different shape. People get obsessed with numbers. What it's about is the impact.
Right. But, I mean, that was what the Brexit Party talked about an awful lot, were the numbers. I mean, but it shouldn't be open-door policy to the EU.
Well, if you are a member of the EU, that is what you're signing up to. If you're a member of the single market, you are signing up to freedom of movement. And it was reciprocal. And that's what Brits so often fail to remember in this debate, is that British people had the opportunity to go and live, love, work, study, retire across 27 other member states. It wasn't just one way. And just, getting back to the report that came out from the government's own advisors this morning, the industries that have the shortage occupations that Damien's talked about, you've got hospitality, you've got agriculture, sectors that were more heavily reliant on EU labour pre-Brexit, have not had wage growth since. They have lagged behind other sectors of the economy.
All right, well, let's just talk about the opportunities of Brexit, which both sides have talked about. But first of all, all right, very briefly, go on.
The 500,000 figure, though, 220,000 students, 170,000 Ukrainians, 70,000 Hong Kong. So we're talking about unique set of circumstances.
Absolutely, and put that into context. But it was a record high. Keir Starmer was talking to ITV's Robert Peston about the impact of Brexit on the economy. Let's have a listen.
I voted for Remain and I campaigned for Remain. But we left. And we're now outside the EU, outside the single market. And the question now is, do we reopen all of that, which I think won't help the economy?
Right, well, that was him on ITV on Monday. Last month, the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, talked about the cost and the opportunities presented by Brexit.
I don't deny there are costs to a decision like Brexit, but there are also opportunities, and you have to see it in the round. And I think what happened with Brexit is because
we made the most of those opportunities yet, though.
Since then, we had literally within months of formally leaving the EU, we had a once-in-a-century pandemic, which has meant the process of outlining what the opportunities are has taken longer.
Do you agree with both of them, Clive, Keir Starmer and Jeremy Hunt, who claim that there are opportunities from Brexit and it wouldn't and hasn't adversely affected our economy?
There will be opportunities from Brexit. You can make that certain elements of it work, I'm sure. But Brexit, so far, has been an unmitigated disaster for this country, economically speaking. So, you can blame COVID, you can blame the Ukraine war, the energy crisis, and the list gets ever longer. But the fact remains that before those things, you can systemically show that Brexit has had an adverse effect on the economy.
Give us an example.
Well, for example, look at the amount of red tape that businesses now face on dealing with our biggest trading partner, Europe, because this government has been unable to have a decent deal due to Northern Ireland and other issues with our European partners. But the key thing for me here on this, and I think Keir Starmer's honest when he says he doesn't want to reopen this up and he wants to secure a new trade and security deal with the European Union. What I would never rule out, at some point in politics, with the Omni crisis, with perma crisis, that joining the single market or rejoining the EU would never come back up on the political agenda. But what I will say, I will just say this, Joe. I will shut up then. But what I will say is that when it comes to Europe, whether joining or leaving, so many of this is displacement activity. We need to sort out our own democracy, our own economy, our own skills and training, the United Kingdom, the constitutional settlement in this country, before we think about going back into Europe or talking about those issues. If we go back into Europe, let's just say it happened tomorrow, we'd come back out because we're a country that is ill at ease with itself and needs to reconfigure itself in the post-war period.
I mean, the idea that you can never, ever see it, that's not a bold sort of vision in that sense, is it? But,
I personally wouldn't mind going back into a much closer alignment with Europe because they're our nearest neighbour. And look at the world around us. Look at the world around. Look at the crisis that it's in.
It's an unmitigated disaster.
Oh, I love the fact Clive said we need to sort out our own. Perhaps he's talking about taking back control. Do you know, what's interesting is the people who ideologically want to take us back into the European Union cherry-pick their statistics and data. And you're saying you can blame, you can't blame the war in Ukraine, you can't blame COVID. Of course you can. In fact,
they are.
At the end of the transition period, we were in the middle of COVID, actually. So that's when Brexit really kicked in. We're only just starting.
So what are the opportunities? What are the opportunities? Bearing in mind we've had this Australia trade deal, which was criticised by a lead Brexiteer, George Eustace.
We're only just starting to see the green shoots of what Brexit can offer now. We've had but a year, and that's no time to do anything, particularly when you're in the middle of unprecedented crises. And we've seen the Edinburgh reforms already when it comes to financial markets. A third of those 30 reforms have been able to be done because of Brexit. We've still got 4,000 bits of EU regulation putting a stranglehold on businesses, on our manufacturing sector. We need to deregulate there. We need to see more trade deals. there's definitely a drag. No one thought...
Is it everything you dreamt of?
Well, it hasn't even started. I mean,
it has for bankers' bonuses.
Okay.
It has for bankers' bonuses.
Listen, there's a key point I want to make.
They're doing all right.
There's a key point I want to make.
And then I'll get them.
Well, yeah, when they're taxed, they're going to add a lot more to the economy. There's a key point I want to make here, which is anybody who thought there wouldn't be a sort of short to medium-term impact of changing the way you do trade in economy from the way you've done it for about half a century was in fantasy land. But when you look at reports by people like PricewaterhouseCoopers, who say that a long-term result of Brexit will be that Britain will far outperform its neighbouring countries.
And the long term is how long?
When we joined the EU, it was 40% of global GDP. Now it's 20%. By 2050, it's due to be 10%.
All right.
By getting us out of that declining, protectionist, closed-door market and re-engaging with the world, that is future politics. That is the way to thrive and survive in a growing global economy.
The optimism is commendable, but I think, not rooted in reality. Most reports seem to be suggesting that you can now disaggregate. Well, no, the vast majority of economists, the OBR, there are all sorts of very reputable organisations associated with the government and independently that are now able to disaggregate the impacts of the pandemic and of the war in Ukraine from the impact of Brexit.
And some of them are forecasts. I mean, they're not disaggregating it right now.
But people aren't stupid. The British people aren't stupid. And last week, Opinion, 65% say Brexit is going badly, just 20% going well. We haven't got cheaper food. We were promised it would be cheaper by Jacob Rees-Mogg. We haven't had the injection into the NHS that was so famously plastered across the side of a bus. It is now much more difficult to travel. It is much more difficult to trade. It is, by most measures, if not every measure, an unmitigated disaster.
All right. Well, on that, where are you, Damien? Because, as you say, you voted Remain. Jeremy Hunt seems to think there are opportunities. Yeah. Is he wrong?
I think Jeremy spoke a lot of sense. And what I find slightly depressing about the last 5 minutes is that this feels like 2016 all over again, where either it's the sunlit uplands or it's a complete disaster. Actually, of course, there are arguments on both sides. Of course, trade is more difficult with Europe when you're outside the single market and the customs union.
And it's
of course
with whom
it is.
We do most of our trade,
but at the same time,
British businesses
at the same time, we are able to sign trade deals with Australia, with India, with growing markets around the world.
With New Zealand that might shrink our GDP.
I'm interested. You cannot take the opposite view. You have to try and heckle it. You have to. And I speak as a former Remainer, but you have to have a balanced view of this, and it will take a long time. And we've had a very difficult period because of the pandemic, because of the war and all of that. And so it's quite difficult to disaggregate the effects of Brexit from anything else. But yes, there are difficulties and yes, there are opportunities. I know that's not a sort of headline-grabbing statement, but it seems to me simple common sense. And we need, as a nation, to be able to have this debate in a rational way rather than yah-boo, it's all great or it's all terrible.
I'm going to come to you in just a second, just to say and welcome viewers from the BBC News channel. You're watching Politics Live. We have about 7 or 8 minutes to go until we go into the chamber at the Houses of Parliament for Prime Minister's Questions, the final Prime Minister's Questions of 2022. Let's hope it's a good one. Clive?
Look, there's truth in what Damien says, clearly. And there's truth in the fact that Brexit has been poor for the economy. But there's also the other side, which is if we walk onto the global stage, just after the pandemic, you can see that internationally, the whole kind of global economic system is in retrenchment, is in retreat because of what's happened to just-in-time production chains. The fact that post-COVID, people now see with the perma-crisis that are taking place, those opportunities for global trade are shrinking. Now, that may or may not continue, but it's a reality that trade now is increasingly regional, increasingly localised. So that's something we've got to look at. But the other thing as well is, one of the reasons I was so against Brexit wasn't for any particularly European identity ideological reasons. It was because I knew what was coming. And I think about Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss. Well, they were coming. If they just rolled that pitch a little better...
You could predict Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng.
Well, the politics and the policies that they were going to... The massive tax giveaways that they were going to give to the wealthy, That's what partly Brexit was about. Deregulation. The Edinburgh Agreement, which is about deregulation of bankers, about allowing the city. And that's been a big part of the problem for the last 50 years in this country.
We haven't got much time, but you might want to respond to that. I mean, it was rejected. It was rejected by the Conservative Party itself, of course, in the end. Wasn't it, Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng's prospectus?
Of course it was. And it didn't work through lack of communication, through trying to rush everything through so quickly. It freaked out the international markets because it meant borrowing would have to soar.
And is that what Brexit was about, deregulation?
Are those policies wrong in the long term in a different context? I don't think so.
OK.
But listen, what I'm hearing from people who are supporting us having a closer relationship with the EU, pretending there was some sort of amazing halcyon days of when we were in the EU and everything was brilliant. It wasn't. It was rubbish for my dad, who was a lorry driver, whose wages went down year upon year. What we need to do, like other countries who are growing enormously right now, is have a long-term futuristic policy, not the modus operandi of short-termist thinking and managed decline. And that means looking at who the biggest economies are going to be by 2050, engaging with them and not being part of a protectionist system where we can't be fleet of foot, we can't think for ourselves, and we cannot make policy for Britain. We've given ourselves the tools to do it. We've had no time yet to do anything with them. So come back and ask me how Brexit's going in 10 years' time. I think a lot of people will agree with me.
If I'm still here in 10 years' time, Alex, I'll be delighted. Now, let's talk about the strikes, because this morning there has been an emergency COBRA meeting, high-level government meeting, chaired by the Cabinet Office Minister. This will be about mitigating the impact of strike action this week and in the next few weeks. Today is the second day of the RMT rail strike. Nurses are going on strike. It's pretty historic tomorrow, as what is going to probably turn out to be a winter of disruption. Let's have a look at The Sun, front page. You've lost it, Lynch. This is talking about Mick Lynch. We'll be talking to him too after Prime Minister's questions, head of the RMT. You've got The Mirror. Nurses. We're doing this for you. Let's take a brief snapshot at public opinion. Latest poll from Ipsos, I should say, shows public opinion is divided when it comes to the rail strikes. 30% in support of the strikers for the union, 36% opposed. Savanta shows public support for strikers at a higher level, around 47% support for rail workers, 63% supporting strike action by nurses, 51% backing the action taken by postal workers. Will the current levels for support for unions hold?
I think so. And I think it will hold because people understand that they're not just fighting for having a pay packet that will put food on the table and pay the energy bills, which they're going to struggle with at the moment, a real terms pay cut with what's being offered. But they're also protecting our public services. The nurses, we're doing this for you. They know that this strike isn't just about pay. Take, for example, you've got the headline on nursing, but take, for example, train drivers and train staff, rail staff. They know that this will make our railways less safe. It will mean that there will be no ticketing offices. It means that there will be driver-only trains, which the government put back on the agenda to scupper it, but they put back on the agenda. That will mean your public services, privately owned, will be less reliable, less safe. They're doing this for us as well.
All right, let's have a look inside the chamber. It'll be filling up for that final PMQs while I talk to the rest of the guests about where public opinion is. Is it a strategy, do you think, here by the government to sort of tough it out? We've had the latest inflation figures. They are actually slightly down, 10.7% on the 40-year high of 11.1%. I think it was, percent. Is it to tough it out until that inflation figure? Do they think it's peaked and it's going to come down?
It's absolutely vital. At the root of all of this is that we drive inflation down. And, for those with long memories or read the history books of the 1970s, the problem was we accommodated high pay when we had a period of high inflation because of the oil crisis, quite similar thing. And because we did that, we then had 10 years of high inflation. The people who suffer most from high inflation are the poor. So driving inflation down is the best thing. Yeah, it has this year. But let's, as you say, inflation is perhaps peaked. Let's hope so. But we need to get it down as fast as possible before it becomes endemic. And it is not just about pay. Clive is right that it's about conditions as well. But it's exactly the point about driver-only trains. There are driver-only trains operating on lots of the train companies in this country. They are perfectly safe. It is sort of old-fashioned. Well, we're going to keep everything the same.
Right. Well, let's take that point, that principle, which is it a trade-off? If the RMT were to agree to reform in this case, as you would probably broadly put it, then do they deserve a better pay offer?
Well, I think that we could afford a better pay offer because it would mean that the railways would be better in the future and more people would use them. The more people that use the trains, the more money we get into the rail system, the more you can afford to pay the staff. It's relatively simple.
What about public opinion? At the moment, it looks fairly evenly divided about who they may support and perhaps who they may blame for this. Do you think that might change once the disruption has set in for a few weeks?
I think why public support has been strong for these strikes is because people resonate with it. They have suffered a decade or more of stagnant growth, of low growth, and certainly low wage growth and real terms cuts. They understand it and they point the finger firmly at the government's economic mismanagement over more than a decade. So that's where the sympathy is coming from. I think until people start to feel that their own personal finances are in a better place, they are going to continue to have support for these people. But let's face it, many of them got us through an incredibly dark period over the last couple of years of the pandemic.
Do you know my problem with this whole debate about public opinion is that's what seems to be running the government and has been running the government for way too long. Focus groups, polling, they're in constant campaign mode, not sorting out issues, but worrying what the headlines are going to say. The fact is, nurses have been chronically underpaid for a long time. These talks should have happened a long time ago when inflation wasn't this high. I do believe, as Damien said, the government can afford a lot of these pay rises. The figures that they're putting out are disingenuous because there'll be a kickback from tax coming back in. I think the closed-door policy is wrong, saying it's protocol that we're not going to talk. That is not mature politics. I think shouting the words union barons to try and curry favour with a certain section of the electorate is just stupid. There's a big crisis happening now. Nurses are underpaid. People are going to be missing hospital appointments. People can't go home and see their families at Christmas. Get around the table and get this sorted.
What would be the solution? If you were doing this for Labour.
The government says that this is going to be inflationary, and as Damien has said.
Yeah, all right,
so if you take that money from people who have that money, and there are people who have that wealth in this country, you take some of that wealth.
Tax the rich more.
I want to tax wealth more, definitely. You take some of that wealth from that part of the economy that either goes to offshore accounts or to savings, and you place it over here, you put it there, and then you give it to those people who need it and spend it in the local economy. Well, you could raise anything, depending on what you equalise with income tax, anything up to 70 billion. And that's been so, but if you want to be able, the governments are talking about 28 billion. This wouldn't cost 28 billion to pay nurses and train drivers. We're talking half that, maybe less than that. So
about 10 billion.
Yeah, about 10 billion. Take that from, and that would not be inflation.
And on that, time for PMQs.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the whole House will share my sorrow at the capsizing of a small boat in the Channel in the early hours of this morning and the tragic loss of human life. Our hearts go out to all those affected and our tributes to those involved in the extensive rescue operation. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, in addition to my duties in this House, including the visit of His Majesty the King. I shall have further such meetings later today.
John Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, a 3.5-hour journey takes 6 hours. A straight journey ends up with 2 changes and a diversion. A train is cancelled at short notice. This has become the experience of a West Coast rail passenger. If Avanti do not get their act together, will the government cancel their franchise?
Very popular question, Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for raising this, and I share the frustration that this is causing to many of his and other communities. Our priority immediately is to support the restoration of services before then making any long-term decisions on the operation of the West Coast franchise, but we will be closely monitoring Avanti's rollout of its recovery plan and holding them account for delivering for passengers.
Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister? Our prayers go out to those who capsized in the freezing waters of the Channel last night. It's a reminder that the criminal gangs running those routes put the lives of the desperate at risk and profit from their misery. They must be broken up and brought to justice. Mr. Speaker, tomorrow will be the first ever nationwide nurses' strike. All the Prime Minister has to do to stop that is to open the door and discuss pay with them. If he did, the whole country would breathe a sigh of relief. Why won't he?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we have consistently spoken to all the unions involved in all the pay disputes that there are. But I am glad he's raised our nurses, because they do incredible work, and it's worth putting on record. It's worth putting on record what exactly we have done for our nurses. Last year, when everyone else in the public sector had a public sector pay freeze, the nurses received a 3% pay rise. When the RCN asked for more in-work training, we gave every nurse and midwife a £1,000 training budget. And when they asked for nurses' bursaries, we made sure that every nursing student received a £5,000 grant. That's because we do work constructively, and we will continue to back our nurses.
Mr. Speaker, nurses going on strike is a badge of shame for this government. Instead of showing leadership, he's playing games with people's health. And there is a human cost. Alex from Chester has been waiting for a gallbladder operation for nearly 6 months. He's in so much pain, he's been off school since then. His operation has already been cancelled twice. His mum, who I spoke to this morning, is worried sick. When she heard that strikes could be called off, she was massively relieved. She's desperate for the Prime Minister to resolve this. All he needs to do is simply meet the nurses. Now, Alex's mum is listening to this. She doesn't want to hear him blaming everybody else. She doesn't want his usual ducking of the question. She's tuned in now because she wants him to explain what is he going to do to resolve the nursing strike.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's not just Alex. There are millions of others across this country, Alex and Mark, millions of others who will have their healthcare disrupted because of the strike. Now, the honourable gentleman says to get round the table, but we all know what that means, Mr. Speaker. That is just simply a political formula for avoiding taking a position on this issue. If he thinks the strikes are wrong, he should say so. If he thinks it's right that pay demands of 19% are met, then he should say so. What's weak, Mr. Speaker, is he's not strong enough to stand up to the union.
Mr. Speaker,
We know it's Christmas, but the party's not started yet. Come on, kiss off.
Mr. Speaker, in 12 hours' time, there's a nurses' strike. All he needs to do is meet the nurses. His inaction speaks volumes. As ever with this Prime Minister, it's Tory politics first, patience second. We've never seen a nurses' strike like this before. They've been forced into it because the government has broken the health system. Ask anyone in the NHS. They will tell you they don't have enough staff. 133,000 vacancies. And there's an obvious solution. Scrap the non-dom status and use the money to bring through the next generation of doctors and nurses. That's what Labour would do. Why hasn't he got the guts to do it?
Mr. Speaker, we're already investing billions more in the NHS. We're already hiring thousands more doctors and nurses. But he asks about backlog. He asks about backlogs and the waiting times in the NHS. And yes, what he always fails to acknowledge is the impact that COVID did, Mr. Speaker. That's why we're facing pressures. But we do have a plan. Not just more money, not just more doctors and nurses, new diagnostic centres carrying out millions of checks and scans, new surgical hubs delivering more elective surgery. But if we'd listened to him, Mr. Speaker, the backlog would still be growing, and that's because we'd still be in lockdown.
As usual, Mr. Speaker, he tries to blame everyone else. His department his department commissioned a report into the NHS which reported on Monday. That report said we've had 10 years of managed decline. Yep. It was not COVID. Yep. Responsibility is sitting right there. And the reason he can't choose nurses over non-doms is because he's too weak to stand up to the tax avoiders. For 12 years, they haven't trained enough doctors and nurses. So we have the absurd situation of the NHS spending billions on agency workers to fill the gap. Why should the country have to put up with money that should be spent treating patients being wasted plugging gaps instead?
Mr. Speaker, let me tell the honourable gentleman what we are doing. We are actually listening to the independent pay review bodies. They want to undermine them. We've offered a fair pay deal. They can't even decide on a number amongst themselves. We're actually protecting the public. They're protecting their paymasters, Mr. Speaker. For working people in this country, it's Labour's nightmare before Christmas.
Here's Starmer. There he goes again, pretending everything is fine. Try telling that to those on waiting lists or those that can't afford to pay for a next-day GP appointment. After 12 years of Tory failure, winter has arrived for our public services. And we've got a Prime Minister who has curled up in a ball and gone into hibernation. If he can't act on behalf of patients or nurses or everyone who wants these strikes called off, then surely the whole country is entitled to ask, what is the point of him and what is the point of the government he's supposed to be leading?
Mr. Speaker, he talks about COVID not having an impact. Ambulance waiting times for Category 1 ambulance waiting times in February of 2020 were actually completely on target, Mr. Speaker. COVID has an impact, and that's why, as the Chief Executive of the NHS has acknowledged, this government is serious about its commitment to prioritise the NHS. But, Mr. Speaker, let's just have a look at the NHS in Labour-run Wales, shall we? The worst A&E times in the country, Mr. Speaker.
Here's Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, under the last Labour government, we had fair pay for nurses and no strikes. Yeah. So I won't be taking lectures from him about that.
Order. Mr. Mulway, you promised to behave. Don't give me a Christmas present you won't want. Come on, Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, this is our final PMQs of the year. So I hope you will Oh, really? I hope you will... Mr. Speaker, what I was going to say was I hope you will pass on all of our thanks, at least on this side, to all those who kept our House and our democracy working. Yeah. And I want to finish this year thinking about our friends in Ukraine. As a result of Putin's barbaric assault on their freedom, millions will spend Christmas in sub-zero temperatures without heating, electricity or hot water. Their suffering is unimaginable, but their bravery is awe-inspiring. So will the Prime Minister join me in saying that whatever other difficulties and disagreements we have across this dispatch box, we are and will remain united in our unwavering support for Ukraine's freedom, its liberty and its victory?
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I join with the honourable gentleman in thanking and paying tribute to all the staff of the House for the fantastic work that they do to support all of us. And I appreciate his comments on Ukraine. It has been a point of incredible unity across this House and indeed the country, something that we can all be proud of in our country, that we have stood behind Ukraine at its hour of need. And as I said yesterday, this Christmas, many families will be laying an extra place at their Christmas table, and that speaks to the generosity and compassion of our nation, and long may that continue.
Angela Richards.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The A3 connects London to Portsmouth through Guildford, and I was delighted to see the new Solent Freeport announced last week, which will increase traffic flows. As the A3 narrows through Guildford, it is sadly the most polluted road in the strategic road network. Short-term sticking plasters like putting up 9-metre-high air pollution barriers that will entrench divisions in Guildford is not acceptable to me or my constituents. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that it is time to think big, it is time to think long-term, and it is time time to tunnel the A3 under Guildford?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for the question. I know this is an issue that she has long championed. I am told that National Highways are developing a range of different possibilities and solutions for the A3 through Guildford, and I know the Department for Transport will consider the case as it plans its future infrastructure investments.
SNP leader Stephen Flynn.
I wish to join with the Prime Minister and the Leader of Opposition in extending my party's thoughts to all of those involved in the terrible tragedy in the Channel this morning. Mr. Speaker, thanks to positive and proactive negotiations between the Scottish Government and Unite and Unison health unions, a pay settlement has been reached and strike action averted. By stark contrast, the UK Health Secretary appears completely unwilling to negotiate with unions on pay, and strike action is very much still on the table. So may I ask the Prime Minister, when will he see the error of his ways and follow the Scottish Government's lead?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm glad the UK Government was able to provide £1.5 billion in extra funding to the Scottish Government for public services. The Health Secretary and other ministers have engaged fully, not just with the unions, but with an independent pay-setting process, which takes the politics out of the process and ensures that we can meet those independent requirements with a fair pay deal.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, let's be clear, those words will ring hollow in the ears of those people who, unlike the Prime Minister, can't nip into Waitrose for their shopping, nor indeed even turn on their heating at this moment in time. And that's particularly true for people in Scotland, because as we know, average energy bills in Scotland are not anticipated to be £2,500 per year. They're expected to be £3,300 per year. People are genuinely terrified, and that's despite the fact that Scotland produces 6 times more gas than we consume, with some 80% of our electricity coming from low-carbon sources. Decades of failed UK energy and regulatory policy coming home to roost. Is it not the case that Scotland has the energy? We just need the power.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm glad the honourable gentleman raised the question of energy support. And it's because of the actions of this government that we are providing every household in this country with around £900 of support with their energy bills this winter, £55 billion worth of support. And on top of that, next year, there will be extra cost of living payments worth up to £1,200 for the most vulnerable, whether that's those on means-tested benefits, pensioners, or indeed disabled. This is a government that will always look after the most vulnerable in our society.
Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my right honourable friend will know, the Mayor of London, despite objections, has decided to expand the ULEZ zone across all London boroughs, which will massively impact my constituents and those who share a border with London. Will he therefore urgently speak to the Transport Secretary and encourage him to use the powers at his disposal to reverse this disastrous decision?
Well, my honourable friend will know that transport in London is devolved to the Labour Mayor of London, but it is disappointing that the Mayor, backed by the Leader of the Opposition, is choosing not to listen to the public. The zone is being expanded against the overwhelming views of residents and businesses, and I'd urgently consider the Mayor and the gentleman opposite to be on the side of hard-working Londoners.
David! Can I associate myself and my party with the comments made by others on the tragedy in the Channel? Our thoughts and prayers are with the families' victims. Mr. Speaker, 40% of cancer patients now wait more than 2 months for treatment after an urgent referral from a GP. That's the highest proportion on record and way above the government's own cancer waiting target. I lost both my parents to cancer as a child, and so, like many people across the country and in this House, I know the devastating impact of treatment delays on cancer patients and their families. So I'd like to ask the Prime Minister 2 questions. First, can he give a cast-iron guarantee that the dreadful cancer backlog won't get any worse? And second, when will the government meet its own cancer target?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm very sorry to hear about the Right Honourable Gentleman's parents. Indeed, I'm sure many of us across this House have our families have been tragically affected by what cancer does, and he's right to raise the importance of meeting our targets. And what I am able to tell him is we actually are experiencing very high numbers of cancer referrals following the pandemic. He'll be aware of that. But thanks to the brilliant work of our NHS staff, cancer treatment rates in the most recent month for which we have data are now back at pre-pandemic levels, with a plan for them to increase further. And recently the NHS also announced plans to fast-track patients direct to cancer tests rather than have to wait for specialist consultation first. These measures will make a difference, and I look forward to updating on them in the new year.
Terry Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With the closure of the last bank in Cheadle, yet another of my local communities has been left totally bereft of a high street banking service. So I was pleased when I heard the announcement that Cheadle was to get a banking hub. Unfortunately, my delight was short-lived when, on closer inspection, I saw that it was Cheadle, Staffordshire. Whilst I remain pleased for the other Cheadle, would my right honourable friend agree with me that my constituents also need access to cash and banking facilities to protect businesses and support our high street? And will he support our local calls for post office banking hubs?
Prime Minister. My honourable friend is a fantastic champion for Cheadle in Greater Manchester. She will know that the Financial Services and Markets Bill will establish a legislative framework for protecting access to cash, and alongside this, firms are already working to provide shared services, as she mentioned, like bank hubs. But what I would encourage my honourable friend to do is to contact Link, which can undertake an independent assessment of a community's cash access needs and determine if shared facilities are appropriate.
Fabian Hamilton.
Mr. Speaker, my constituent Sharon has an 11-year-old daughter who suffers from eating disorders and severe anorexia. She was forced to spend a year in hospital in Sheffield, 40 miles away, because there were no beds in Leeds for children with those eating disorders. This, Mr. Speaker, is completely unacceptable. So will the Prime Minister now commit to ensuring that NHS mental health provision for young people is dramatically improved so that no other family has to ever again endure similar trauma?
Minister. Well, first of all, can I say to Sharon and her family, I'm sorry about what she's experienced. The honourable gentleman makes an excellent point. Mental health funding, as he knows, is increasing, so we ensure parity of service. He's also right to raise the issue of eating disorders. It's something that provision is currently expanding for. I think 2,000 more children were given the treatment and advice and support they needed last year, and there are plans to go further because it's an issue that needs tackling.
Jason McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Police Constable Nicola Hughes and PC Fiona Bone were savagely murdered in Manchester whilst on duty a decade ago. Nicola's dad, Bryn, is my constituent. He lives in Marsden. He was in Parliament again last week, continuing his campaign for emergency service workers and police officers who die whilst on duty to be awarded the Elizabeth Medal posthumously. Does my right honourable friend agree with me and Bryn that now is the time to commemorate and honour our brave police officers and emergency service workers who make the ultimate sacrifice by awarding posthumously the Elizabeth Medal?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for his question, and I thank his constituent Bryn for his campaigning. Every life lost in the line of duty is a tragedy, and we remember the lives and service of PCs Nicola Hughes and Fiona Bone. We are determined, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that sacrifice that police officers and other public service officers make is recognised, and we are carefully considering the best and most appropriate ways to do this.
Kirsty Blackman.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Across these islands, people are suffering because of the woefully inadequate policies of this UK Tory government. They've crashed the economy, left millions in fear of the cold this winter, and are stoking division over striking workers rather than negotiating fair pay deals. Why is it that the only people that can rely on this Prime Minister are questionable PPE suppliers in the House of Lords, bankers and former Prime Ministers getting taxpayer-funded handouts to defend their partying through COVID?
Mr. Speaker, the only people stoking division in our United Kingdom are the party opposite.
Question 12, sir.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, our priorities are growth, investing in public services and giving businesses the confidence they need to invest. I look forward to discussing this with the Mayor of the West Midlands.
Michael Fabricant.
Mr. Speaker, when my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, recently visited the National Memorial Arboretum, he was slightly late. But I don't blame him, because he had to come by road. Now, my friend, the Mayor of the West Midlands, is supporting an extension of the cross-city line from Birmingham using an existing freight line to make it into a rail service to the National Memorial Arboretum and beyond. So, may I ask my right honourable friend, will he revisit the National Memorial Arboretum again, see the Armed Forces Memorial, and also come to Lichfield and see why we need a leisure centre?
I'd be delighted to come and visit the National Memorial Arboretum again, see my friend and the fantastic Mayor of the West Midlands, Andy Street, to discuss his plans to drive growth and opportunity in the region.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is now well over 3 years since the Conservatives promised the end no-fault evictions. Enfield has the highest rate of Section 21 evictions in London. 30 families in my constituency in the last month alone were made homeless as a result of Section 21. I have families sat in my office trying to keep warm as we try to find them emergency accommodation. Will the Prime Minister scrap this shameful legislation? If so, when?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady will know that we have announced plans to do that and we await parliamentary time. But it's not the only thing we are doing to protect renters, Mr. Speaker. We have passed legislation already to protect tenants from rip-off fees, and we've capped holding deposits because we want to make sure that renters do have the protections that they require and they have their decent homes to rent.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Small modular reactors are a hugely important part of our future energy mix. And this Conservative government realised that when it awarded Rolls-Royce nuclear section, based in my constituency, a grant of £210 for development. But there's still no clarity or plan for moving from development to deployment. Will the Prime Minister come with me to meet Rolls-Royce to discuss how to move things forward and ensure the UK benefits from this exciting opportunity?
Well, my honourable friend makes an excellent point. I'm delighted that government has awarded £210 million to Rolls-Royce SMR last year for research and development. This does have the potential to benefit the UK and support our energy security and climate goals. I look forward to getting updates and for working with my honourable friend to see this fantastic new technology come to life.
McCarthy.
When my constituent who has dementia was taken ill recently, it took 3 hours for an ambulance to arrive. He then spent 10 hours in the back of an ambulance outside A&E, queuing to get in. And the doctor said to him, "I'm so sorry, we're treating you out of the back of a truck." But as we've heard, the King's Fund has said that the government has presided over a decade of neglect, of managed decline in the NHS. So isn't it the Prime Minister, not that doctor, who should be apologising?
Well, Mr. Speaker, that same King's Fund report also acknowledged that there was 40% more funding going into the NHS under this Conservative government. But we do need to make sure that that funding makes a difference. That's why this winter £500 million is being deployed to move people out of hospital beds into social care, to speed up those discharges specifically so that ambulances won't be queuing as much as they currently are. And that money is already making a difference on the ground.
Sakib Bhatti.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The community in Kingshurst, which I represent, has suffered an unimaginable tragedy earlier this week when 4 children fell through the ice at Babs Mill Lane. Sadly, 3 of the children did not survive, and one, a 6-year-old, is fighting for his life. They and their families are all in my thoughts and prayers. Will my right honourable friend pay tribute to the community in Kingshurst, which has come together and is supporting each other to get through this tragedy? And will he recognise the heroic efforts of the emergency services, including the police officer who used his bare hands to try and break through the ice and then jumped in the water with fire service personnel without the PPE, risking their own lives to save the young children?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend, and can I send my condolences to the family and friends of all of those who lost their lives. I also join him in paying tribute to our emergency services for, as he said, their incredibly selfless actions. This whole event has completely shocked the local community, and I know that my honourable friend will continue to do all he can to support his constituents at this difficult time.
Dame Angela Riedel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This year, the Tory party has given us 5 education secretaries, 4 chancellors, 3 prime ministers, 2 leadership coups. And Mr. Speaker, the Partridges had to sell the pear tree to pay the gas. So, Mr. Speaker, isn't it the case that after a year of Tory chaos, incompetence and self-indulgence, the best Christmas present the Prime Minister could give to the British people is a general election?
Mr. Speaker, they're happier with that than before, Mr. Speaker. But all I'd say, when it comes to what the British people need this Christmas, Mr. Speaker, in order to ease the disruption on their lives, the best thing that the party opposite could do is tell their union bosses to call off these damaging strikes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After the Second World War, Winston Churchill sent British Conservative lawyers to help to draft the European Convention on Human Rights, and that's something that we can be proud of in this country. But in an age of mass migration, the ECHR is now limiting our ability to control our borders. So in light of the tragedy in the Channel this morning, does the Prime Minister agree he should do as Churchill did, draft a new framework for refugees and human rights, including legal routes, but one way or another, and if necessary alone, we must be prepared to leave the ECHR?
Mr. Speaker, as I told the House yesterday, our new legislation will deliver a system whereby a person who comes here illegally will have no right to stay and will be removed to their own country or a safe third country alternative. That is the system that the British people want to see. That's a system that we will deliver, and I look forward to hearing whether the party opposite will support it.
Sir Olney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As temperatures are plummeting and the cost of living crisis is deepening, ordinary families are facing a Dickensian nightmare across the country this Christmas. Mortgage bills are soaring, household repossessions are up, and nearly 500,000 tenants face a threat of eviction after falling behind on their rent. Too many people are worrying about where they and their children will wake up on Christmas morning. So will the Prime Minister agree to a temporary ban over the festive period on repossessions and evictions so that nobody has to live in fear of losing their home this Christmas?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we provide a range of support to both homeowners and tenants who are in difficulty already. But the most important thing we are doing to financially support them through the winter is by providing almost £900 of support with their energy bills, on top of all the additional support for those who are most vulnerable, including pensioners. That demonstrates the actions of this government to help the country get through what we acknowledge is a challenging time.
Stephen Crabb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tomorrow, Mr. Speaker, at 9:30, you'll lead this House in a 1-minute silence to mark 80 years since the British government recognised that the Holocaust was taking place in Nazi-occupied Europe. As we come together to mark that moment, will the Prime Minister join me in praising the Holocaust Educational Trust and the extraordinary survivors who continue to do amazing work, ensuring that the next generation understand and learn the lessons from the past?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, 80 years ago, Parliament listened in stunned silence as the truth of the Holocaust was spoken in this House for the very first time. So it's absolutely right that you, Mr. Speaker, lead a moment of silence in which we will stand together to remember and reaffirm that truth. I join my honourable friend in paying tribute to the work of the Holocaust Educational Trust, and it could not be more fitting that Britain's Holocaust Memorial and Learning Centre should be built right next door to here to Parliament. We must never forget the Holocaust, and we must stamp out anti-Semitism and prejudice in all its forms, wherever we find it.
Chris Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Caerphilly County Borough Council recently announced a £3 million cost of living hardship fund to help those most in need in Islwyn and across our county borough. Does the Prime Minister think it's right that local authorities are forced to cover the costs of 12 years of economic mismanagement by this Tory government?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, what the honourable gentleman fails to acknowledge is that because of the actions of this UK government, not only are we supporting people in Wales and across the United Kingdom with help with their energy bills, we've also provided £1.2 billion of extra funding for the Welsh Government to use to give to local authorities to support their constituents, and he would do well to acknowledge the benefits of the United Kingdom and the actions of the UK government.
We have a record 4,000 newly qualified doctors training to be GPs, which is really excellent. But we do have an issue with retention, which is made even worse in areas like mine, which have extremely high housing growth. As the son of a GP, what will the Prime Minister do to fix this?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know this is an issue that my honourable friend has talked and championed for a long time, and he's right to do so. We do have record numbers of GPs in training at the moment. We're also making sure that we support primary care appointments and primary care access, and I know that my honourable friend, the Health Secretary and Chancellor, are looking at how best we can increase retention, particularly with regard to pensions, and I look forward to getting his suggestions.
Final question, Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In a written response from the DWP, it was confirmed to me that an unpaid carer earning more than £132 a week in their job is classed as being in gainful employment and as a result loses their carer's allowance of £69.70 a week. Now, caring doesn't stop. It never stops. So can the Prime Minister explain to me the rationale of this decision, given that we are trying to get economically inactive people back into work? And secondly, can he explain why it's his government's position that £132 a week is enough for people to live on?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I first start by paying tribute to those up and down the country who give up so much of their time to care for others. And I'm actually delighted that the government is supporting the honourable member's bill, which will give a week of highly flexible paid leave to unemployed carers. I think it's the right thing to do, and I'm grateful that the honourable lady is taking it forward. The carers allowance is a means-tested benefit. It's part of many other benefits that are available to support people, and as I've said, right now there is significant support in place for people through Christmas with their energy bills.
That completes Prime Minister's questions.
That brings us to the end of the final session of Prime Minister's Questions for 2022, and it was dominated by the issue of strikes, certainly between Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak. Let's welcome our guests for this part of the programme, the final PMQ's programme. We have for the government Maria Caulfield, Health Minister, for the Labour Party, Liz Kendall, a Shadow Social Care Minister, and Chris Mason, the BBC's political editor. On strikes. Keir Starmer started by saying to Rishi Sunak that this is the first time, as we know, in their history that nurses in England, Wales and Northern Ireland are going on strike, that it was a badge of shame for the government. And Rishi Sunak responded saying that Labour doesn't actually have a policy to deal with strikes. They just have a formula of words. But as we sit here now, these strikes are going ahead.
They are, and they're big, aren't they? And they're going to be carrying on throughout the Christmas period into the new year. I think it was the dominating theme of political conversation in January and February, with other unions likely to ballot for and go for strike action, not least schools in England and Wales. I thought the argument we heard really from the two political leaders today of the main Westminster parties were familiar ones. So you had, Rishi Sunak making his argument that you have to have these independent pay review bodies, and if they're going to have any value, then you've got to honour what they say. And teasing Keir Starmer about what he precisely is saying and precisely what he is not saying. So Labour is saying that they would get back round the table and they would be willing to talk money, but they then don't answer the question, well, how much would you be willing to pay them, other than to say that 19% would be too much. I think clearly, though, the challenge for the government is that They are in government. Governments get blamed, fairly or otherwise, don't they, when you see industrial action on this scale. I think as we head into the new year, the big challenge or the big question, and I don't think we know the answer to this yet, is how does public opinion change? Do people get sick and tired of the strikes and just hacked off with union action? Or does the blame land with the government? And crucially then, which side buckles first? Is the government willing to move at some point on money? They insist not at the moment. Do strikers or the unions think the cost of striking is too great?
How is this resolved, Maria, unless the government is prepared to not just come to the table, but to talk about money?
Well, as pointed out, there's strike action in 3 of the 4 nations in terms of nurses' strike. You know, the Labour government in Wales have also got this situation, and I'm not hearing much from them in terms of their negotiations.
But let's talk about what you... How do you think... You're a health minister. How do you think this is resolved unless you talk about money?
Well, we have set out our stall pretty clearly, and the Secretary of State did meet with Pat Cullen, head of the RCN, earlier this week.
But they didn't talk about pay.
Well, they did talk about pay, but I think they didn't come to, obviously, an agreement on pay. We have been very clear that the Independent Pay Review Body is the body that sets the pay recommendation, and the government accepted that in full across the board. Also, you know, last year when there was no one else in the public sector getting a pay rise, there was a 3% increase for nurses. Yeah. We have to be, you know, we have to be honest with the British public that if for every percent of a pay increase, that's £700 million. That money has to come from somewhere. We've seen, you know, in previous weeks and months what happens if you do that through borrowing. So the alternative is to take that out of the current spending. We absolutely need to deliver on those.
So there is no way of resolving it, is it? Because as we've heard, and we will hear from Mick Lynch, who is the General Secretary of the RMT union, they aren't going to accept 3% or anything around that rise when inflation, as we know, is 10%. It's come down, or 10.7%. So, hearing you, there isn't a resolution.
Well, I think for the rail workers, there was a higher offer than that on the table, which they chose not to accept. But we do have to remember also the inflationary pressures. If we did do inflationary pay rises, we're just starting to see inflation come down. That's the biggest enemy to every single household in this country.
All right.
And, you know, inflation-level pay rises will only make that worse.
Liz, what is the resolution? A formula of words. There's no actual policy from Labour.
I think that there will have to be, as all situations like this, there has to be compromise on both sides. I thought it was very interesting that the RCN and Unison said, meet with us to discuss pay, and if you don't want to do it like that, go through the arbitration service, ACAS. People do want a resolution for this, and I think that is an option that the government should look at.
I mean, it's interesting, though, that we've heard that, yes, Labour has, and Keir Starmer has said, we would get round the table and talk about pay, but we wouldn't actually make an offer, a firm offer. So what would be the point?
What we're saying is, you know, asking us to pick a number out of thin air now when we don't know what the economy is going to be like in 2 months' time, let alone 2 years. But can I just say, Jo, we need to understand why we are in this situation in the first place, which is that for this 12 long years of this government, there has been pathetically low or no growth. So we have not had the money to put into our public services, including for a fair deal for staff. That is the underlying reason why we're here. And I think the public sees our vital local services run down. They want a solution, and the government hasn't delivered.
People will have noticed that Mick Lynch has come into the studio, General Secretary of the RMT union. What did you make of the exchanges that you heard there between Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak on the issue of resolving these strikes?
Well, I'm sure some politicians find it entertaining, but there's lots of people out there that are struggling who want some solutions. There are nurses and rail workers. There will be teachers coming into this. There's public sector workers right across the country that cannot cope with the wages that they're being paid. They are being underpaid for their labour. And the government has got to come up with a solution to that. The government is actively torpedoing the talks on the railway dispute. I've been in the room when the executives of the railway tell me the government will not allow a solution that we, the executives, could put to you to develop up into a programme.
So what is the solution, Mick?
The solution is that we need compromise, as has been said.
But what does that look like?
Well, it means that we get a modification of the programmes that they want to put forward in terms of stripping out our members' terms and conditions, that we get a security guarantee on jobs, and we get an improvement in the pay offer. The pay offer is ridiculously low. Our members have not had a pay rise for 2 or 3 years, And the offer that's been put, that somebody said was high over there, is 4% in each of 2 years that covers a period where inflation has been 22%. And beyond that, we didn't have a pay rise for 2 years before.
All right, ridiculously low. So what would be acceptable?
Well, I'll deal with that with the employer. I'm not going to deal with you.
Well, hang on a second, because no one wants to... Everyone says it's about pay and it's about money.
You can't
and
negotiate
I've just asked
with me, Jo, can you?
No, I can't. But it would be good to get... It would be a good... Well, except you've been round the table and you can't seem to, or rather, union members have been round the table and they still haven't.
I've been allowed to negotiate. These executives have said to me, I am not allowed by a government minister, the Secretary of State for Transport, who's been overseen by Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak. Yeah. I am not allowed to put a document on this table that I have drawn up and would take us forward to resolving this.
Well, I am going to allow you. I'm going to give you the freedom and liberate you from those constraints so that we can hear at least where your thinking is on this. And I'm going to do the same with both the Conservatives and Labour here so that people can understand what is in the minds of the important players in this negotiation. Because, as we've heard, we've got a wave of industrial action. We have got nurses going on strike for the first time in their history. So would a pay rise at inflation, let's take today's latest figures, 10.5%, just over, would that be in the ballpark?
Well, our union's policy is for a substantial increase in salaries. We don't tie it to a particular level of inflation. RPI is the reference point, and RPI is taken off like a balloon that's gone loose. Nobody can catch it. And this myth that the Tories are putting round that workers' wages have created inflation is an utter fallacy.
Well, they're saying pay rises would.
Well, we haven't had any pay rises. How can our members' inflation of wages contributed to inflation when they haven't had any at all?
Do his members deserve, Mick Lynch's members, deserve a pay rise substantially more than 4%? Let's take the 10.7%, today's inflation figure.
Well, I haven't been involved, obviously, in the transport negotiations, but what we've said to nurses is that that's why we've got an independent pay review body. It's interesting that Liz says that Labour would negotiate, but they're not doing that in Wales with their members. And the midwives in Wales voted to go on strike yesterday, but the midwives in England didn't. So, you know, I think there's a range of issues there. I think, Mick, you know, it would be helpful to know, because my understanding is that when you have been in discussions, it's not necessarily about the pay, it's about the conditions that you're not happy with. And I think to say it's just about pay, I think is
slightly
misleading.
It's about pay. Your ministers have given a mandate to the companies that say you must cut conditions, you must increase unsocial hours, you must change roster patterns, and you must cut the safety regime on the railway by 50%. That's what the mandate your government has given to Network Rail and to the train operators. Last Sunday, or the Sunday before last, the Secretary of State instructed the train operating companies to demand driver-only operation, a thing that they know we can never, ever accept. So your government has directly torpedoed those talks and sunken the process.
Maria?
Your government is responsible directly for these strikes this Christmas.
I don't agree with that. I mean, if you meet with people who are travelling on the trains trying to get to work, who also often have their rosters changed, who often has to do unsocial hours, they're being put in a position this Christmas that they can't get to see their families, they can't get to work. Why can't you accept that?
Because it's been our policy for 40 years. Everybody in the industry knows that will never be acceptable to our union.
Never.
The executives that you charge with that.
But Mick, you talked about. Hang on, Mick. You talked about when you answered my first question. You talked about compromise, saying we will never do X, Y, and Z. We will never accept that. Where's the compromise?
Got a 35-page document full of changes on the railway, and DOO wasn't in it. It was acceptable to the train operating driver-only operation.
Yeah.
It was acceptable to the railway executives, the most senior people in the industry. They went to Whitehall. Whitehall sent them back on a mission that they could never complete because it undermined the talks.
Right, and in terms of the pay review body, I mean, let's just talk about this because people will think the pay review body, what do they do? Why can't you go beyond what this body that is tasked with coming up with public sector increases in pay or not? You can go beyond what they offer. You can go higher than the 3% that they suggested. It isn't written in law that you can't, and governments do. The SNP have just agreed slightly higher wage increases than the pay review body, as Stephen Flynn said there, with various unions. Why can't you?
So we could, but what I'm saying is that will cost money to do that.
Right.
We either have to borrow that money, and we've seen in recent weeks what that does to the economy when the government borrows substantial amounts of money. Because we're talking about £10 billion just to deliver the RCN 19% increase, or we take it from services, and they are political choices. We absolutely need to get on top of those backlogs.
Borrow money to feed nurses.
But we've got to get on top of. We're opening up new surgical hubs. We're opening new diagnostic centres. We've got very sick people on waiting lists, and they're our priority.
Would you borrow the money? Would Labour borrow the money to pay more to nurses and railway staff, or would they tax more?
We absolutely want to see our nurses getting a fair pay rise.
And what does that look like?
More. I can't pluck a number out of
I
nowhere.
asked Mick to put the number between, let's say 3 or 4%, or 10%, which is around inflation.
But I think what Maria hasn't recognised is that we have got 50,000 nurse vacancies at the moment, 9,000 doctor vacancies. Last year, the NHS spent £3 billion on agency staff instead of tackling the root cause of the problem, employing and training more doctors and nurses, as we've said we'll do, by scrapping the non-dom tax status and retaining them by having better terms and conditions. I've got a food bank at my hospital because the nurses can't afford to pay their bills after everything they have been through. The negotiation needs to happen. Both sides need to give ground. And all I would say is, I understand people want all the details from us now, but our track record in government, there wasn't a national strike in the NHS, there wasn't a national strike
what's Labour doing
on the
in Wales,
railways.
where you're actually in
on our
government
track
there?
record, I tell you what, if you look at the Labour government's record on pay rises, fair pay rises for nurses and other staff, record levels of satisfaction with the NHS and the lowest ever waiting times. Nurses over the last 12 years have given their all. The situation is getting worse. And what people want isn't this conversation going round and round and round again. They want the government to get round the table and
So you're going to do that in Wales?
We will always negotiate. We will always negotiate to get a solution.
Chris?
That's what we've done in the past and is what we'll do in government.
I just wonder about the battle of wills. From a perspective of a viewer watching our conversation this lunchtime, thinking, right, the government is broadly saying, and I simplify to make a point, but we're not going to budge on pay. And Mick, you're saying, we're not going to budge on certain things that you are digging your heels in negotiation-wise, and you talk about pay amongst other things. So who blinks first here? And I put it to you, Mick, how much appetite will your members have, who are striking because they feel they haven't got enough money to pay the bills, to carry on striking when that's taking a financial hit to them, taking a financial hit to the union? How much appetite, if this drags on, if the government continues to say we're not budging on pay, can you guys keep going for?
Our members have expressed their appetite. We've had 2 ballots on strike action. They both delivered a 9-to-1 mandate. This week we had a referendum on this wonderful offer that the Tories keep telling us is on the table. It was rejected on an 85% turnout. 2/3 of our members voted
but that's
against
different
it.
from coming out gay.
And they're out. They're out today.
I get
They've
that.
been out for the last 2 days, and they'll be out. What we'll be doing tomorrow is going back in the room with a government minister, all the heads of the industry, to try and get a deal. And we understand compromise. What we're not getting from the other side is any compromise whatsoever. They escalated the dispute at the final moment when a 35-page document was going to be delivered to us.
Because at the moment it doesn't sound like there will be any time soon. How many strikes could we be looking at in January and February?
I mean, I don't sit down with a whiteboard saying let's have a strike.
Well, you must do it at some point.
Well, no,
we'll
review the action we've got. The reason we've got the action now is because they're imposing the changes from tomorrow without agreement. Network Rail. We've got statutory redundancy notices against us, so we have to take the action now to try and get them to change
Could it escalate? Could you do more strikes?
It can continue until we get a deal. Our campaign will run. I don't have a target number of strikes.
I think that the public low, if you've got a government, they're supposed to be for a purpose, which is to solve problems. Currently, the government is making the problems worse. If they're setting a mandate that they know can't deliver on the trains, if they're refusing to have a proper discussion about pay with patients, the public wants it sorted, and they want to know, after 12 years, what is the point of this government when they can't get from A to B on the trains, they can't get to see their GP, they can't even get a passport or a driving licence.
Is your policy materially different on public sector pay? I haven't heard that it's materially different? Because if we're talking about pay, you're still not responding to the sorts of demands.
Let me say it is materially different in that we believe, and actually have always proven, that we negotiate to get deals, that we have a proper plan to recruit the doctors and nurses we need in the NHS, and crucially, Jo, a plan to grow the economy.
Right, but
Because
that's
the
a longer
reason
term...
I know, but that is so important, because the reason we're in this state is because the Conservatives have crashed the economy and don't have the growth we need to invest in our trains and invest in our hospitals and GP services.
And from the government's perspective, it's absolutely nailed on, cast iron, that you will not budge on pay in any of these disputes.
I think the government have. The ministers did put an offer to the unions, the rail unions, which was rejected by the members.
But any movement north higher than where we are right now.
Well, I'm not involved in the rail negotiations. So obviously, but an offer on pay was made, was put to mixed members, which they rejected. So clearly there are negotiations going in that direction. In terms of the health pay, we are committed to that independent pay review body, and we are very clear with the public. If we were to move on that pay, that money has to come from somewhere.
Definitely no budging at all.
Well, Liz says she's got and Labour have got a very different mechanism, but I don't see any negotiations happening in Wales. The midwives are going to be going on strike in Wales, where Labour run the health service there, and I don't hear any figures or any movement on pay there either.
Have you heard anything different from Liz Kendall? Have you heard anything from Keir Starmer and the Labour front bench that would fill you with any reassurance that it would be different with them in terms of a pay offer?
Not on pay, particularly. I don't hear anything. I think they're going to take a very similar fiscal line to the Tories. But I'm not hearing anything on workers' rights either. We've had prevarication in the last week about what they're going to do about reforming workers' rights in this country. So we want them to be a bit bolder. We want them to be bolder on energy, on housing.
Can I come back on that?
I will, and I'm going to get you to come back, because just before you came in, we had Clive Lewis. Clive Lewis was here sitting in this chair talking about wealth taxes to pay for the sorts of, let's say, at inflation pay rises that might or might not be discussed. Now, we don't know precisely how much it would cost. The government think beyond 20 billion, but let's say at 10 billion is one of the figures that we've heard of. Richard Bergen, another Labour MP on the left of the party, has this as a suggestion for how to raise the money.
Through a series of wealth taxes, no cuts whatsoever are necessary. And if you give me 20 seconds, I can demonstrate that very easily. I've got it written in front of me here. End non-dom status, £3 billion. Annual 1% tax on wealth over £5 million, £10 billion. 45 pence income tax rate over £80,000 and a 50 pence rate over £125,000, £6 billion. And finally, if you equalise dividend and capital gains tax with income tax rates, that would raise £21 billion. Those measures I've just read would raise £40 billion, which is exactly the amount of money the government is saying it needs to cut. And the reason that we've got this is because we've got a Prime Minister and a government that is on the side of the super-rich.
Is that the sort of thing that you would like to see the Labour Party adopt?
I want to see everybody taxed appropriately from the lowest paid.
And what does that mean?
Well, it means things like that Richard has put there. Tax is not just about income. It's about accumulated wealth, which is usually accumulated off the work of other people. The rich don't create wealth in this country. It is the workers of this society that create all wealth, and they should get a fair redistribution of that. And if Labour could do one thing, it could put redistribution on the front of its manifesto, and they'd get massive support.
We absolutely have said that we would scrap the non-dom tax status and use that money to have the biggest...
That raises about £3 billion.
...of the NHS workforce. I mean, still, if you could actually... That is
of course, but that's not 40 billion, which is what Richard was saying. Very easy to raise 40 billion.
A much clearer and stronger tax on the energy companies to help people with the cost of living, and we've said we'd scrap the unfair tax.
Public ownership, like we used to have.
Well, we've also said that when those contracts come up, they will come back into public ownership. And let me come back on this point that we haven't said anything on workers' rights. You will know that our New Deal for Working People says right to flexible working for day one, new sectoral pay agreements. The first one we'll do is for social care workers, the issue that I represent. Absolutely critical, because those social care workers are really struggling.
Then you say the government
We've already been bolder by scrapping the non-dom tax status, getting rid of the unfair tax loopholes that private schools had, and having a much fairer system of taxation for the energy giants. All of that, we have been clear where we want to invest in our public services. We'll show where the money is spent.
Well, there you go.
And to be honest, I think that is a lot further than where this government has
We support the Workers' New Deal. But there seemed to be some doubt on it last week under some questioning that they wouldn't fully oppose these new laws that they're bringing in to shackle the trade unions, and that maybe not all of the New Deal would come through. So if it comes through, we will support that.
I mean, I haven't seen that, Matt. Maybe I missed that last week, but I haven't seen that. We're absolutely committed to the New Deal for working people.
Do you worry, Mick, about losing public sympathy?
Well, we want the public on our side, and they have been largely on our side. We understand the frustration and anger that comes forward, but...
Which is going to get worse, presumably.
Well, we get an awful lot of support from the travelling public and from other members of the public in the wider community. I've been getting messages while I've been waiting to come on here saying, keep going, we need to change the way this society works. Most people in this country are fed up of the way they're being treated in the workplace. And if you take the average health worker, my wife is a 38-year nurse, right? Everybody's at the end of their tether. GPs, community nurses, other clinicians that are not nurses are at the end of their tether because this health service is being crushed so that they can get it ready for privatisation in the near future.
Oh, well, Maria, do you want to answer that?
Well, as a nurse and a union member myself, you know, I'm absolutely, you know, recognise the hard work that everyone has put in during COVID and now dealing with the backlog. You know, I've been a nurse for over 25 years. These are really hard times and lots of efforts going in, which is we absolutely recognise. But to say we're crushing the NHS, we've got record funding going into the NHS. You know,
speak to some NHS staff. They
I am a member of the
right
NHS
now.
staff, so you know, I don't need any lectures from Mick on that front.
All right. Well, on that note, Mick Lynch, thank you for joining us, and thank you for being here in the studio, and of course, Chris Mason. From all of us here, bye-bye.